Ethan Moore, just 12 years old, wasn't like other children. Charming, manipulative, and terrifying. What the city would soon discover would forever redefine innocence. Today, we dive into the dark story of a boy who collected the remnants of his victims, savoring every moment. The first time Detective Ryan Cole stepped into Ethan Moore's bedroom, he felt a chill creep up his spine. On the surface, it was the room of an ordinary 12-year-old boy. A neatly made bed, shelves lined with trophies from soccer tournaments, and posters of comic book heroes plastered across the walls. But beneath that innocent facade lurked a darkness that would haunt him for years. The computer on Ethan's desk hummed quietly, a mundane presence hiding the horrors it contained. Cole's team immediately began their methodical search. Each folder they opened revealed pages of violent, obsessive fantasies. There were meticulously drawn sketches of people in various stages of harm, diagrams detailing the human body, with notes about weak points, and disturbing captions that suggested not curiosity, but entirely premeditated cruelty. Some of the images were shocking in their graphic detail, illustrating methods of torture and murder that would make seasoned detectives recoil. Beside the computer lay a stack of notebooks, their edges frayed from constant handling. Cole carefully leafed through them, the ink-smeared pages revealing a meticulous mind at work. Ethan had cataloged everything: decomposition rates, the estimated time it took for evidence to vanish, ways to mislead investigators. His notes were clinical, almost scientific, but with an undercurrent of sadistic pride. There was no doubt. These were not the musings of a troubled child who had gone too far. These were the blueprints of a predator in the making. But the real shock came with the discovery of a hidden compartment under the bed, expertly concealed beneath loose floorboards. Detective Cole had expected maybe something illicit, perhaps stolen money or trivial keepsakes. Instead, he found a box. And inside the box was a collection that defied comprehension. Trophies, objects taken from his victims. Some were grotesque remnants of animals, carefully preserved. Others were human, small, intimate pieces of a life that had been stolen. Among the items, one stood out with piercing clarity, a small silver wallet chain. It gleamed under the harsh light of the forensic lamps, innocuous at first glance, but immediately recognizable. It had been a gift from Daniel Carter's father, a token of a milestone in his life. Now, it was nothing more than evidence of Ethan's triumph, a physical manifestation of the young predator's narcissistic obsession. Cole placed each item on the evidence table, documenting every detail with painstaking care. As the items were revealed, the air in the room seemed to grow heavier. There was a palpable sense of dread, the kind that doesn't fade even after decades of experience. Every object was a window into Ethan's mind, each piece a testament to a childhood corrupted by pure, calculating evil. The detectives exchanged glances, silently acknowledging the same horrifying truth. This was no isolated incident. This was the beginning of a collection, the first piece in a gallery of human suffering that Ethan had been assembling, methodically and deliberately, for years. And in that moment, standing in a room that had once seemed ordinary, Detective Ryan Cole understood a chilling fact that would haunt him long after the investigation was over. The darkness in Ethan Moore was not an aberration. It was the foundation of who he truly was. By the time the investigation team had finished cataloging Ethan Moore's macabre collection, the full scope of his depravity began to emerge like a shadow unfurling across a room. The notebooks, the sketches, the trophies, they were all evidence of something far more sinister than a fleeting act of violence. They revealed a mind that didn't merely fantasize about cruelty, but one that planned, curated, and took pride in it. Detective Cole had seen killers before, but there was something about Ethan that unsettled him in a way no adult perpetrator ever had. He wasn't just reactive. He was proactive, a hunter in miniature form. There was a precision to the way Ethan observed, cataloged, and executed his thoughts. Each page of his notebooks contained not only diagrams of murder, but also detailed psychological profiles of potential victims. Names, routines, preferences, vulnerabilities, all noted with meticulous care. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, almost clinical, but the intentions were anything but innocent. It became clear to the team that Ethan had been grooming himself for this role for years. His interests in serial killers were not casual fascinations. They were manuals of study. Each new fact about notorious killers absorbed and integrated into his personal playbook. He studied their methods, their mistakes, their obsessions, and internalized their lessons. By the age of 12, Ethan was not merely a boy with violent thoughts. He was a predator actively preparing for the act of killing. Interviews with peers and neighbors painted a portrait that was just as chilling. Ethan had a magnetic charisma, a strange combination of charm and subtle intimidation. Other children gravitated toward him, unaware of the psychological games at play. He had learned early how to manipulate, to seduce with words, to create loyalty, and to punish those who stepped out of line. He was a leader, a king in a microcosm of fear and fascination. But it wasn't just social manipulation. His family described moments that, in hindsight, were deeply troubling. Small incidents, almost laughable to a casual observer, that revealed a cold disregard for consequence. Animals left in distress, classmates frightened with cruel pranks, teachers unsettled by a calculated indifference to others' pain. Every incident was a stepping stone, a test of his own capacity for dominance, a rehearsal for something far darker. And then there were the trophies, the physical proof of his conquests, the wallets, the chains, the small personal objects stolen from victims. They weren't taken for utility or money. They were symbols of control, tokens of mastery. Each item carried a story, a moment when Ethan had exerted total power over another life, a moment that he could relive in the privacy of his room. The silver wallet chain, the first human memento, gleamed not as evidence, but as a badge of victory, a mark of a predator's pride. By the time Detective Cole and his team compiled the evidence, the horror was undeniable. Ethan Moore was not a boy who had gone too far. He was a predator in full bloom, a calculating mind with the patience to plan, the charm to manipulate, and the cold detachment to execute. He had understood, at an age when most children were concerned with games and schoolwork, that power could be taken, controlled, and treasured. The question that haunted everyone involved was simple and terrifying. How long had he been preparing? How many more could have fallen victim if the box under his bed hadn't been discovered? The answer wasn't comforting. The notebooks hinted at a growing collection, at plans that extended far beyond a single act. Christopher Davis was not an isolated incident. He was the first specimen in a long, meticulously curated gallery of death. In the quiet moments of reflection, long after the evidence had been secured and the headlines had begun to take shape, Detective Cole understood the chilling reality. The world often believes that children are innocent, that evil must be tempered by youth. But Ethan Moore had proven that darkness can incubate quietly, nurtured behind closed doors, waiting for the moment to manifest in its purest form. The true predator had been revealed, not a child, not a lost soul, but mind that had chosen cruelty as a vocation, and who, even now, bore the pride of that choice. And for those tasked with stopping him, the realization was sobering. This was just the beginning. As the courtroom lights glinted off polished wood and the oppressive Miami heat seemed to seep through the walls, the stage was set for a battle of narratives. The prosecution had meticulously painted Ethan Moore as a calculated predator, a boy whose childhood had been a mere veil over a monstrous intellect. Now it was the defense's turn, or at least their desperate attempt, to salvage the impossible. The defense team, a well-dressed cadre of experienced attorneys, moved with the confidence of those who had faced the court many times. Yet beneath their composed exteriors lingered a tension that betrayed the enormity of the task. They had to convince 12 jurors that Ethan was not a predator, but a victim of circumstances beyond his control. That a child capable of such meticulous cruelty was, somehow, still a child at heart. Their strategy was twofold: humanize the monster and pathologize the acts. Expert witnesses were called, carefully selected to provide a veneer of scientific credibility. Dr. Meredith Lane, a psychiatrist known for diagnosing rare disorders in high-profile juvenile cases, took the stand with an air of calm authority. She spoke in clinical tones about intermittent explosive disorder, a condition she claimed could trigger sudden, uncontrollable violent outbursts in children. To her, Ethan's trophies and detailed journals were not evidence of premeditation, but manifestations of a mind overstimulated by internal chaos, a mind incapable of distinguishing fantasy from reality. The courtroom absorbed her words with an uneasy mixture of skepticism and intrigue. Some jurors leaned forward, ears straining to reconcile the meticulous horror they had already witnessed with this new, comforting narrative. Could a 12-year-old be both a cold-blooded predator and a helpless victim of his own brain chemistry? The defense hoped that seed of doubt would grow. Yet every attempt at justification only deepened the sense of unease. Prosecutor Laura Bailey rose with the calm precision of a surgeon, each word measured, each question designed to strip away the illusions of innocence. She walked Dr. Lane through Ethan's journals, the sketches, the stolen trophies, the carefully cataloged routines of his victims. The evidence was overwhelming, and with every page turned, every diagram examined, the psychiatrist's explanations began to crumble. Bailey did not shout. She did not glare. She allowed the evidence to speak for itself, a slow, merciless unmasking of the narrative the defense had so desperately constructed. "Doctor," she said, her voice low, steady, "you claim these acts were impulsive, uncontrollable. Yet here we see planning spanning months, precise documentation of victim schedules, items taken deliberately. How does this align with an uncontrollable impulse?" The expert faltered. Every answer became more convoluted, more desperate. Her diagnosis, once presented as a shield, now appeared as a fragile construct, unsupported by facts, vulnerable under scrutiny. Bailey had exposed the fatal flaw. The defense could argue sickness, but they could not deny intentionality, pride, and calculation. When the defense made the fateful decision to put Ethan Moore on the stand, it was a gamble born of desperation. They imagined a child lost, frightened, capable of evoking sympathy even from the most horrified juror. Ethan took the witness box with an unervingly calm demeanor. His small frame, so incongruous with the enormity of his crimes, should have betrayed weakness. Instead, his eyes held a glint, a subtle, unnerving pride. At first, he played the role well. Soft-spoken, tentative answers, a slight tremor in his voice. He spoke of confusion, fragmented memories, feelings he could not explain. For a moment, the jury hesitated, their minds caught between the human child they saw and the calculated killer they knew. It was the defense's brief victory, a fleeting sense that the narrative might hold. But Bailey, like a predator herself, moved with deliberate precision. She retraced each step of Ethan's actions, confronting him with evidence so precise it could not be denied. She asked about the wallet chain, the journals, the animal trophies. She played the recording of his own confession, calm and unflinching, describing the murder with a chilling pride. With each question, the mask of remorse slipped, revealing the predator beneath. The breaking point came not with yelling, not with confrontation, but with quiet, unrelenting exposure of truth. Ethan's small body trembled, not with fear, but with the realization that even his carefully curated performance could not hide his own arrogance. In a moment of raw, terrifying honesty, he whispered, almost gleefully, that he had enjoyed the act, that it had been satisfying. The courtroom froze. The defense's last line of hope had crumbled under the weight of undeniable evil. By the time Ethan left the witness stand, the jurors understood. There was no frightened child behind the headlines. There was a predator, fully aware of his actions, fully conscious of his pride in them. The defense, with all its expert witnesses, all its arguments, all its desperate attempts to rewrite reality, had failed spectacularly. The case had become not a debate over culpability, but a revelation of unmitigated malice, a confrontation with the darkest depths of a human mind in miniature. The trial would move forward, but the die had been cast. Ethan Moore's true nature had been exposed, and for everyone present, the horror was absolute. Evil, in its purest, most calculated form, can sometimes wear the face of a child. The room was dim, sterile, and unyielding. A single overhead light cast stark shadows across the concrete walls of the interrogation room at Miami's Juvenile Detention Center. Outside, the city hummed with life, oblivious to the darkness that lingered behind locked doors. Inside, Detective Marcus Reynolds and his partner, Detective Sofia Alvarez, sat across from Ethan Moore, a 12-year-old boy whose small frame belied the monstrous mind that had orchestrated a trail of horror through their city. Ethan's eyes, cold and calculating, followed their every movement. He leaned back in his chair with a casual arrogance that made the seasoned detectives uneasy. This was no frightened child, no remorseful teen caught in a terrible act. This was a predator, aware of the theater, aware of the power of attention. Every word, every pause, every flicker of his gaze was a performance, a challenge, a test of control. Detective Reynolds began with soft, measured words, trying to peel back layers of the boy's carefully constructed persona. "Ethan," he said quietly, "we need to understand why. Why Christopher Davis?" For a brief moment, there was silence. Then Ethan tilted his head, a faint, almost imperceptible smirk playing on his lips. "Why?" he repeated, his voice soft, almost teasing. "Because I could. Because it was fun." The word hung in the air like a poisonous fog. It was the first glimpse of the unfiltered truth, a revelation that the detectives had feared, yet secretly expected. He leaned forward, eyes glinting in the harsh light. "It's like collecting," he said. "Like I said, you understand, don't you? Every person has something. Something I want. Something I can keep." Detective Alvarez swallowed hard, fighting to maintain professional detachment. "You mean trophies?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might ignite the darkness in the room. Ethan's grin widened. "Trophies. Memories. Proof. Everyone leaves something behind. Christopher left his chain. I took it. I keep it. It's mine now." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle, like a cold stone dropped into the heart of the room. Reynolds leaned in, carefully controlling his tone. "And the other journals? The plans, the lists? You weren't just acting on impulse, were you?" Ethan's eyes glimmered with a dangerous mixture of pride and amusement. "Impulse? No. Impulse is messy. I plan. I think. I wait. Everything I do right." His voice was unervingly calm, devoid of fear, devoid of regret. It was not the voice of a child, but of a mind that had meticulously rehearsed every moment of cruelty and control. Detectives pushed further, probing the boundaries, seeking the cracks that might reveal human weakness. But Ethan offered none. He described his actions with clinical precision, almost academically, as if he were narrating a case study rather than recounting real human suffering. He detailed the journals, the maps, the schedules of potential victims, the ritualistic collection of trophies. Each revelation sank into the detectives' minds like knives, the reality of his methodical cruelty more horrifying than any fantasy they had imagined. Then came the moment that would define the interrogation. Reynolds produced the audio recording of Christopher Davis's final moments, the confession Ethan had delivered in the cold, detached tone of a child who had long abandoned any semblance of empathy. They played it slowly, allowing every syllable to echo in the room. Ethan's expression did not falter. If anything, he leaned forward, listening with a flicker of pride in his eyes. "You like that?" he asked, almost conversationally. "I said it. I said it all. I can say it again. I could any time." Detectives sat back, their skin crawling with the magnitude of what they were witnessing. Here was a child not just unremorseful, but exhilarated by his own monstrosity. A child who had transformed the act of murder into performance art, whose pleasure derived not from destruction alone, but from the power to horrify, manipulate, and dominate. As the interrogation drew on, Ethan began to reveal fragments of his internal logic, his worldview. To him, life was a game, a series of moves and counters, prey and predator. He spoke of the collection as though it were a museum of achievement, a ledger of victories. He discussed future targets with chilling detachment, the outlines of plans he had already considered. Each detail was delivered with a precision that left no room for doubt. The monster had been fully formed, fully conscious, and terrifyingly competent. By the end of the session, Detective Reynolds knew with absolute certainty that Ethan Moore was beyond rehabilitation. He was not a child who had made a terrible mistake. He was a predator, aware of his capacity for cruelty, and reveling in it. The interrogation room, stark and lifeless as it was, seemed to close in around the detectives, a claustrophobic chamber where evil had taken form in the most unassuming of packages, a 12-year-old boy with the mind of a calculating killer. As Ethan was led from the room, His smirk never faltered. The detectives exchanged glances, the weight of what they had learned settling like a stone in their stomachs. This case was no longer just about a single murder. It was a glimpse into the heart of a calculating young predator. A predator whose capacity for darkness had only just begun to reveal itself. And somewhere in that casual, small frame, in the childlike face that masked so much, lurked the undeniable truth. A lifetime of horror had been set in motion, and they had caught only the opening act. The courtroom was a stage of dread, the air thick with anticipation and the faint metallic tang of fear. Miami's sunlight streamed through the tall windows, but it did nothing to illuminate the shadows that had taken root in the room. Every seat was filled, yet the attention was focused entirely on the small figure at the defendant's table. Ethan Moore, 12 years old, a boy in appearance but a predator in essence. He sat there with a quiet, unnerving confidence, his tiny hands clasped before him, his eyes glinting with the kind of cold calculation that made even the most hardened detective shiver. The trial had been a crescendo of evidence, each revelation more horrifying than the last. Trophies, journals, maps, and the audio of Christopher Davis's final moments. But nothing in that room could have prepared the audience for what was about to come. Prosecutor Laura Bailey approached the witness stand with the precision of a surgeon, her gaze never leaving the boy. The air was tense, a taut string ready to snap. She had seen the evidence, heard the confessions, understood the depth of evil that she faced. Now she needed the jury to see it too, not in fragments, not in notes or jars, but in its purest form, the unrepentant, gleeful face of a monster. Ethan was called to testify. The small boy stood, his frame shivering slightly, but it was not from fear. It was a calculated performance, a prelude to the ultimate display of control. For a moment, he allowed the courtroom to see the facade. A trembling voice, downcast eyes, a hint of shame. Some jurors leaned forward, hearts tugged by the faintest whisper of sympathy. Then Laura Bailey began her cross-examination. She spoke softly, methodically, guiding him through the details of the crime. She asked about the wallets, the journals, the plans he had meticulously crafted. She reminded him of his own words, the recording where he described Christopher's murder in cold, exacting detail. Ethan's mask began to slip. A subtle twitch of the mouth, a glimmer in the eye. The world he had built around himself, the carefully controlled performance of innocence, started to crumble. And then, in a single, horrifying moment, it shattered completely. "You want to know what happened?" he shrieked, voice transformed from the soft timbre of a child to the venomous snarl of something older, something unhinged. "I killed him. I killed him, and I loved it. And I'd do it again." The courtroom froze. The sound echoed off the high walls, the sheer force of its silencing whispers, gasps, and the shuffling of feet. The boy, the predator, had revealed himself fully, unfiltered and proud. His parents wept silently, their denial obliterated in a moment of unadulterated terror. Lawyers buried their faces in their hands, realizing that every strategy, every plea of diminished responsibility, had been swept away by a voice too powerful, too unrepentant to ignore. And then it came, the laugh. Short, sharp, jagged, a bark of amusement that seemed to ripple through the room like a poison. Ethan Moore laughed at grief, laughed at sorrow, laughed at the chaos he had wrought. His eyes sparkled with perverse delight as he watched Robert and Maria Davis, their faces raw with anguish, their bodies trembling under the weight of his mockery. The sound was an affront to decency, empathy, and reason itself. Jurors who had maintained their composure began to weep, some burying their faces in hands, others staring with a mix of pity and anger that burned like acid. Even Judge Arthur Hughes, a man known for his stoicism and cold precision, leaned forward, knuckles white, eyes fixed on the boy with a fury so palpable it seemed to pulse in the air. Ethan's laughter was not merely a sound, it was a declaration. It was a signal to the world that he reveled in his own monstrosity, that remorse, guilt, or fear were foreign concept to him. He had become the orchestrator of terror in its most refined form, and he delighted in the suffering of those around him. Every sob, every tear, every shudder of horror fueled him, and he knew it. Detectives, prosecutors, and spectators alike felt the room shrink under the weight of pure malevolence. Each heartbeat seemed to echo Ethan's words. Each inhale a reminder that evil can take the smallest, most unassuming form. The sunlight outside, once bright and vibrant, now seemed cold, artificial, and distant, incapable of touching the darkness that had been summoned within these walls. Finally, the bailiff stepped forward, moving to restrain him for the recess. But even as he was led away, his smirk remained, that chilling, self-satisfied smile. A mask of pride and defiance lingered as a reminder. The cage of law had yet to contain the true essence of the monster. For Miami, for the Davis family, and for every soul present in that courtroom, the laugh of horror would echo long after the walls had emptied. It was a sound that spoke not of a child, but of a calculated predator, a warning, a scar, a haunting melody of human darkness made flesh. The city had glimpsed the abyss, and in that glimpse, it understood a terrible truth. Monsters are born in places we least expect, and sometimes they arrive in the smallest packages. The courtroom had not yet recovered from the echo of Ethan Moore's laughter. The horror of his confession, the audacity of his unrepentant glee, still lingered like a thick fog. But the trial had one final act, one revelation that would etch itself into the collective memory of everyone present. The undeniable truth that the murder of Christopher Davis was not an isolated act, but the opening chapter in a dark, meticulously planned series of future atrocities. Prosecutor Laura Bailey approached the jury once more, her eyes scanning each face, noting the lingering disbelief, the shock, the dawning comprehension. The witness she called to the stand was a boy no older than 13, pale and trembling, his voice almost too quiet to be heard. He was Ethan's former friend, a boy who had once idolized the predator now sitting before them, whose conscience had finally overcome fear. He stepped forward, clutching a notebook to his chest like a shield. Every eye in the room followed him, every breath held in anticipation of the revelation he carried. His testimony began hesitantly, almost like a whisper carried across a vast and silent tomb. I was friends with Ethan, he began, voice cracking. And I saw things. I know things that nobody else does. He was planning more. He wasn't done. The room fell silent. Not a whisper, not a cough. Only the faint hum of the air conditioning, as if the courthouse itself were holding its breath. Every head turned toward the boy, sensing the magnitude of what was about to be revealed. He opened his notebook carefully, as though the pages themselves contained a virus that might infect those who dared to look. Ethan called it the collection, he said, voice low and trembling. He had a box under his bed. Not just animal parts, but other things. Names, plans, schedules, people he wanted to take next. A murmur rippled through the courtroom, but Laura Bailey raised a hand, commanding silence. The witness continued, each word heavier than the last. He described the journals filled with potential victims, classmates, neighbors, delivery workers, a young mother down the street. Each page meticulously detailed, each life catalogued and dissected as though he were studying insects under a microscope. He said he wanted them. He wanted their pieces. The boy whispered, almost breaking under the weight of the confession. He showed me the wallet chain, the notebooks, and he asked me if I wanted to help him. The words hung in the air like a noxious cloud. The jury, already traumatized by the evidence of one murder, now faced the impossible. The realization that Christopher Davis had been the first in what Ethan Moore had envisioned as a long line of victims. The predator had been caught at the beginning of a career he had carefully plotted, a trajectory of horror that only the laws of chance and the courage of a frightened boy had halted. Ethan himself remained unervingly calm. His face betrayed no shock, no regret, no panic. He leaned back slightly, eyes narrowing as he watched the witness, a king observing a subject who dared to betray him. The courtroom seemed to shrink under the weight of his presence, the air growing thicker, suffocating, as if the very walls recoiled from the magnitude of the evil contained within the boy before them. Bailey guided the witness through the details, eliciting the most damning facts with surgical precision. The boy described meetings in secluded areas, the games Ethan invented to lure his victims, the silent, charismatic manipulation that had drawn other young boys into a twisted orbit of fear and admiration. Ethan's friends were not mere witnesses, They were pawns, potential accomplices in a dark apprenticeship designed to cultivate more cruelty. The jury could hardly breathe. Each revelation chipped away at any remaining notion that this was a tragedy born of a single impulsive act. Instead, it became horrifyingly clear. Ethan Moore was not merely a child who killed. He was a student of death, a predator in embryonic form, meticulously curating his future gallery of horrors. As the testimony concluded, the boy stepped down, eyes wide and haunted, leaving the room in stunned silence. Ethan's lips twitched, not in fear or remorse, but in that same unsettling smirk that had haunted the trial since the beginning. It was a small, chilling gesture, a silent acknowledgement that his plans had been revealed, but that the essence of his darkness remained untouchable. Judge Arthur Hughes, whose face had been an impassive mask through the prior chaos, finally allowed himself a long, slow exhale. The truth had been laid bare, undeniable and damning. Ethan Moore was not merely guilty of a single horrific act. He was a future threat, a carefully forged predator whose potential for evil had been fully documented, whose instincts for manipulation, control, and cruelty had been nurtured and celebrated within his own mind. The city of Miami, which had thought it understood the depths of horror in their streets, now faced a new terror. The knowledge that monsters do not always announce themselves with violence alone. Some cultivate their darkness quietly, patiently, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And in the case of Ethan Moore, the moment had been narrowly prevented by luck, by courage, and by the fragile conscience of a 13-year-old witness who had dared to speak the truth. As the courtroom slowly emptied, the image of Ethan Moore remained etched into the minds of all who had witnessed the testimony. A boy no taller than the witness stand, yet carrying the weight of unimaginable malice. A predator in the making whose future, if left unchecked, could have been catastrophic. His smirk was a promise, a reminder that even in defeat, the seeds of a monster's mind are difficult to erase, and some darkness, no matter how confined, never truly disappears. The courtroom was thick with a silence that felt almost physical, oppressive, like a storm about to break. Every seat was filled, every eye fixed on the small figure at the defendant's table. Ethan Moore sat there, hands clasped loosely in front of him, his expression unreadable, or perhaps terrifyingly readable to those who had come to know the boy behind the monster. The trial had revealed everything. The trophies, the journals, the plans, the manipulation of his peers. There could be no doubt, no rationalization, no hope for mitigation. Prosecutor Laura Bailey rose, her presence commanding, her voice steady, though her eyes betrayed the weight of what had been endured. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, "you have seen the evidence. You have heard the testimony. You have witnessed the unvarnished truth of who Ethan Moore is, and what he is capable of. Today, the law will acknowledge what we all already know. Justice must be served, not only for Christopher Davis, but for every life he sought to destroy." The judge, Arthur Hughes, had been a figure of stoic authority throughout the proceedings. His face, lined with years of experience and tempered by decades on the bench, now carried the rare, unmistakable weight of righteous fury. He cleared his throat and addressed the court. "Ethan Moore, the acts for which you have been found guilty are not the impulsive missteps of a child. They are the deliberate, calculated, and cold-blooded expressions of a predator. Your age, your youth, do not mitigate the danger you pose, nor do they erase the suffering you have inflicted." The room was suffused with the energy of collective grief and barely contained anger. Robert and Maria Davis sat in the front row, hands trembling, faces pale and strained. The image of their son, taken so violently, and the revelation of what might have come next, had carved deep, permanent scars into their very beings. Their presence was a living testament to the stakes of the proceedings, the human cost that extended far beyond the courtroom walls. Judge Hughes continued, his words deliberate, measured, each syllable striking with the weight of finality. "The court has considered the severity of your crimes, the premeditation, the trophies, the writings, and the evidence of grooming others into your plans. This court acknowledges the unique challenge your age presents, but there can be no question of the danger you pose to society. Therefore, It is the judgment of this court that you are to be sentenced to the maximum juvenile penalty allowed by law." A murmur passed through the audience. Ethan Moore's expression remained unchanged, a slight tilt of the head, a flicker of curiosity rather than fear. Even now, he seemed to be observing the proceedings as though they were an experiment, a play in which he was both actor and audience. The judge's voice grew firmer, colder, as he pronounced the terms. "You shall serve a life in juvenile detention, with the possibility of parole only after 25 years. Until that time, you will remain separated from society, confined to ensure the safety of others and to prevent any further acts of calculated violence. Let it be known that this sentence is not merely punitive. It is protective, preventive, and necessary." Ethan's smirk, that constant, chilling mark of his arrogance, finally faltered. For the first time, the reality of consequence seemed to brush against the fortress of his mind. His small frame stiffened, and the mask of indifference cracked. For a brief moment, the audience glimpsed the rawness of a child confronted with the weight of his own choices. But even in that flicker, there was no remorse. Only the faintest trace of disbelief that the world had, at last, imposed limits upon him. Robert Davis could barely contain himself. The bellowing sobs of a father whose son had been stolen from him, now coupled with relief that a greater catastrophe had been averted, filled the room. Maria Davis buried her face in her husband's shoulder, tears streaming freely. The jury, once stoic and composed, allowed themselves to exhale, the collective tension breaking in waves of visible emotion. Ethan's parents, who had clung to hope throughout the trial, finally allowed their own despair to surface. They slumped in their seats, faces ashen, the weight of denial replaced by the harsh reality that their child was no longer just a boy. They had created, nurtured, and failed to contain a monster. As the bailiffs moved to take Ethan from the courtroom, he rose, not in surrender, but with a measured, deliberate grace. His smirk returned, subtle and chilling, as he turned briefly toward the jury. It was a final, silent declaration. The body may be caged, the freedom curtailed, but the mind, the predator within, remained untamed. Judge Hughes struck the gavel. The sound echoed like a hammer upon stone, reverberating through the chamber and into the city itself. It was a sound of closure, of justice enacted, and yet, an acknowledgment of the darkness that had been glimpsed, if only briefly, in human form. The courtroom slowly emptied, leaving behind the heavy, lingering sense of horror and awe. Ethan Moore, the boy who had been both charming and cruel, manipulative and deadly, was now removed from society, a lifetime of vigilance awaiting him. But for those who had borne witness, the trial left an indelible mark. The knowledge that monsters can be born, nurtured, and recognized, yet still defy complete understanding. Miami would heal slowly, its people returning to the rhythms of their lives, yet carrying with them the memory of a 12-year-old boy whose darkness had been fully revealed. A cautionary tale, a story whispered to children, a chilling reminder that evil can sometimes arrive wrapped in the most unassuming forms, and that justice, however delayed or imperfect, must never waver. And somewhere, behind the steel bars of a juvenile detention facility, Ethan Moore smirked, quietly asserting that even in captivity, the predator within him would never be truly tamed. Even as the gavel fell and the courtroom began to empty, a chill hung in the air, a residue of unease that refused to dissipate. The verdict had been pronounced, the sentence delivered, and yet the world seemed to sense that the story was not yet finished. Ethan Moore, small in stature but monumental in menace, remained seated, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the walls of the courtroom. The audience had left. The press had retreated to their notebooks and cameras, and the city outside was slowly returning to its sun-soaked routines. Inside, however, one final act remained. Ethan's parents lingered, clinging to the hope that perhaps, at last, the child would show a sliver of contrition, a hint of fear. But Ethan had other plans. Slowly, deliberately, he rose from the bench, his movements measured and purposeful. The guards, uncertain of what he might do next, kept a careful distance, hands hovering near the restraints, eyes locked on the boy, who had already rewritten the rules of fear in their world. He turned toward the family of Christopher Davis, Robert and Maria, still standing, their grief raw and unhealed. A small, chilling smile curved his lips, not the twitch of a boy caught in remorse, but the calm, self-satisfied expression of a predator fully aware of the power he still held. He raised his voice, not in panic, not in desperation, but in cold, deliberate clarity. "You think this ends here?" he said, each word dripping with calculated menace. "You think walls and bars can stop me? You think locking me away will erase what I am?" The words hung in the air like smoke, suffocating and heavy. Robert Davis's hands tightened into fists, knuckles white, yet he remained restrained, barely able to contain the storm of rage threatening to erupt. Maria trembled beside him, a fragile figure confronting the unthinkable, that the boy who had murdered their son could still command terror even in defeat. Ethan walked slowly toward the center of the room, eyes scanning the empty courtroom with the casual arrogance of one surveying his dominion. His voice dropped to a whisper, yet every word carried the weight of threat and finality. "I've already begun," he said. "You think Christopher was the first? The only one? No, he was just the start. And now I've been stopped. But do you think that changes me? Do you think I won't learn? I will survive. I will wait. And when the world thinks it has won, I will still be me. And nothing will ever change that." The guard stepped closer, an unspoken acknowledgement that words could now carry the force of action. Yet Ethan's smirk never faltered. His eyes, sharp and unyielding, seemed to pierce through steel and stone, as though the walls themselves could not contain the predator within. Then, just as suddenly, he laughed. Not the juvenile giggle of a child, but a low, resonant sound, sinister, confident, and utterly devoid of remorse. It echoed off the walls, filling the chamber with the undeniable assertion of dominance. The laugh was a punctuation mark, a final signature, declaring that even in captivity, the mind that had orchestrated horror remained untamed. The judge's gavel struck again, more forcefully this time, demanding silence, control, and order. Ethan paused, turned, and allowed the guards to lead him away, but a smile lingered, a shadow that would not be dismissed. It was the last act of defiance, a reminder that even the strictest justice cannot fully penetrate the darkness within some minds. As the courtroom emptied completely, the air remained heavy, tainted with the echo of his presence. The journalists, witnesses, and families departed with a single thought lodged deep in their minds. Ethan Moore had not only committed murder, had not only terrorized the community, but had also shown the world that the evil in human nature can be patient, unyielding, and frighteningly self-aware. And in that silence, the city of Miami understood a hard truth. Monsters are not always the products of circumstance. Sometimes they are born, nurtured, and even when caged, they leave a permanent, dark mark upon the world they inhabit. Ethan's final act was not physical, nor violent in the traditional sense. It was psychological, a haunting assertion that control, fear, and influence need not end with a gavel. He had left the courtroom, but the echo of his defiance, the quiet terror of his mind, would linger long after, a permanent stain on the city's collective consciousness. Even behind steel bars, Ethan Moore had claimed his final victory, not over the law, but over perception itself. He had proven, unequivocally, that a predator's mind is never truly tamed, and that the shadows he carried would always remain, a whisper of darkness in a sunlit world. Long after the courtroom had emptied, long after the gavel had struck for the final time, the city of Coral Bay, or what remained of its sense of security, was left to reckon with the shadow Ethan Moore had cast. The trial had closed, the sentence had been delivered, yet the story did not end with the boy behind bars. It lingered, like a stain that refused to wash away, a cautionary whisper threading through the streets, the schools, and the homes of every parent who had once believed their children were safe. The legacy of horror was subtle at first, a tremor beneath the surface of everyday life. Children looked over their shoulders when passing darkened alleys. Neighbors avoided the parks where laughter once rang free. Teachers spoke in hushed tones, warning students that monsters can come in any size, any face, even the one that sits quietly in your classroom, seeming so ordinary, so harmless. The community, fractured by fear and disbelief, began to change, shaping itself around the memory of Ethan Moore's crimes. But the legacy went deeper than fear. It was the persistent echo of a mind that had been allowed to cultivate darkness unchecked. The chilling reminder that evil does not always announce itself with brute force. It often creeps in with charm, intelligence, and patience. Psychologists, criminologists, and law enforcement officers dissected the case for years, poring over Ethan's journals, his meticulously kept lists, his notes on victims, his own writings about control, power, and the thrill of the hunt. Each page revealed the deliberate shaping of a predator, the careful construction of a mind that had known from the beginning how to wield terror as a weapon. The Davis family, haunted by the memory of Christopher, became a symbol of resilience and grief, their lives forever shadowed by a violence they could neither predict nor prevent. They spoke publicly, warning communities, supporting laws for juvenile accountability, and dedicating themselves to victims' advocacy. Their personal loss transformed into a larger crusade, an attempt to prevent the horrors inflicted by one child from repeating elsewhere. Yet, even with Ethan behind bars, the true depth of the legacy was the knowledge that what had been stopped was only the beginning of a potential chain of horrors. Investigators discovered that Ethan had studied other infamous killers, their methods, their successes, and their mistakes. The journals contained plans not merely for Christopher Davis, but for a network of targets, strategies for abductions, and chillingly precise timelines. Though he had been contained, the blueprint of evil remained, a testament to the patience and cunning of a mind that had been born to hunt. The media would recount the story for years, retelling the trial as a cautionary tale. A boy who was not simply a child gone astray, but a predator forged in secrecy, ambition, and cruelty. True crime documentaries, articles, podcasts, and public forums dissected every detail, not only for the shock value, but to understand the anatomy of predation, manipulation, and moral corruption. Ethan Moore became a symbol, a warning that horror does not always announce itself, that darkness can reside in the smallest, most unassuming forms. In the streets of Coral Bay, parents whispered the name of Ethan Moore to their children, not in casual fear, but in grim instruction. They warned of charm, of manipulation, of the dangers of trusting appearances. Schools instituted programs to recognize early signs of deviant behavior, while law enforcement studied the psychological red flags that had been tragically overlooked. The shadow of one boy's cruelty had reshaped an entire city's understanding of danger, and no amount of sunlight could fully dispel it. The legacy of horror was ultimately not only the death of Christopher Davis, nor the stolen innocence of the children who had once been Ethan's peers. It was a permanent scar on the collective consciousness of Coral Bay, a reminder that monsters can be born, that evil can be patient, that even in triumph, the law cannot fully erase the terror inflicted on the human heart. Every time the streets seemed quiet, every time a parent turned off the lights for their child, the echo of that smirk, that laughter, that calculated cruelty lingered, proof that the true horror was not only in the acts committed, but in the mind that had conceived them, and in the chilling realization that such minds could exist, unnoticed, anywhere. The city would rebuild, the Davis family would find some measure of peace, and Ethan Moore would serve a sentence. Yet the legacy of horror, patient, cunning, and deeply human, would endure far longer than any prison walls, a shadow over a sunlit world, a reminder that evil, once born, never truly dies. It only waits for the next opportunity to manifest. As the courtroom doors finally closed behind the last echoes of testimony and sobs, the city of Coral Bay exhaled a collective sigh, though the relief was fragile and the peace temporary. The case of Ethan Moore was over in the legal sense, but its psychological and emotional reverberations would endure for decades. Coral Bay had survived, yes, but it had been forever changed, its innocence shattered, its sense of safety fractured by the calculated cruelty of a child whose mind had been incubated in secrecy and nurtured with obsession. The truth of the horror lingered in the empty spaces left behind. Empty bedrooms, abandoned parks, the silence of playgrounds where laughter once rang free. Family spoke in whispers of the boy who should not have been, a name now synonymous with a cautionary tale that no parent could ignore. Teachers, social workers, and psychologists carried the weight of this knowledge with them, embedding vigilance into everyday life. reminding themselves and others that even the most ordinary child might harbor a darkness unimaginable. Yet beyond the grief, fear, and the shadow cast over Coral Bay, there was a quiet acknowledgement of resilience. The Davis family, despite their unending sorrow, became a living testament to the power of human endurance in the face of absolute evil. Their voices, once raw with anguish, became instruments of advocacy. Their pain transformed into education, their loss into a bulwark against future tragedy. Communities began to learn, to recognize the warning signs, to understand that evil can take root early, patiently, and without outward display. And then there was the haunting truth that would never vanish. The mind of Ethan Moore remained unrepentant, even behind the steel bars of juvenile confinement. His arrogance, his pride in his crimes, and the cruelty embedded in his very nature were facts that no sentence could erase. The smirk that had so terrorized the courtroom lingered in memory, a specter of the capacity for darkness that exists within the human heart. Psychologists continued to study his case. Law enforcement shared his files across jurisdictions, and parents whispered warnings, but the chilling understanding remained. The birth of a predator is a possibility as real as life itself. The city tried to move on, to return to its sun-drenched streets, its laughter-filled parks, its everyday routines. Yet every shadow, every quiet corner, every unexplained absence was now imbued with tension, a subconscious acknowledgement of the fragility of safety. Coral Bay had been forever marked, a permanent scar etched into its collective consciousness by a 12-year-old boy who had wielded cruelty with the precision of a master. In the end, the legacy of Ethan Moore was not only the lives he had taken or the terror he had inflicted. It was the lesson that evil can appear anywhere, in any form, and at any age. It was a lesson written not in textbooks, but in the trembling voices of survivors, in the haunted eyes of a grieving family, and in the quiet vigilance of a city that had been forced to reckon with the unthinkable. As the sun set over Coral Bay, bathing the city in golden light that belied the darkness beneath, one truth remained undeniable. Some shadows are too long, some horrors too profound, to ever be forgotten. And though justice had been served, and though Ethan Moore had been caged, the shadow he cast, the memory of his cruelty, his laughter, and his unwavering malice, would linger, a chilling testament to the depths of human depravity and the fragile veneer of safety we all cling to. If you want to continue uncovering the darkest corners of human nature, to understand how evil hides in plain sight, and to explore true crime stories with the depth and tension they deserve, subscribe now and turn on notifications. Don't miss a single chilling revelation, because some horrors are too compelling to ignore.